delighted that you're all here. I know some of you have been at previous events, but I want you to know we saved the very best to last. We've got a wonderful panel up here, and my job is to introduce Dan Schnur, who will be moderating it, the panel, and then he will introduce the rest of the panelists. For those of you who aren't familiar with the center offers an MPA program. We do some executive education, and we're very much a part of the Price School, and we like to bring our illustrious faculty up from Los Angeles so that they can speak to you and you can ask them questions and learn from their expertise. Tonight, Dan Schnur is the director of the Jesse Unruh Institute of Politics at the University of Southern California, which is housed in the Dornside's College of Letters, Arts and Social Sciences, Arts and Sciences. The mission of the Institute is to motivate students to become active in the world of politics and to encourage public officials to participate in the daily life of University of Southern California. Dan is extremely well known. You probably already are familiar with some of the things that he's done. He's past chairman of the State Fair Political Practices Commission and has been and still is one of California's leading political and media strategists. He's worked on not one, not two, not three, but 4 presidential campaigns and 3 gubernatorial campaigns, and he is widely quoted and writes political commentary and op-eds for a variety of media outlets.
Thank you for that very optimistic applause. I want to echo Janet and tell you how happy we are to have all of you here tonight. It's been a tremendous series over the course of the fall, and I really do think that we are finishing the series with what I believe will be the best of the conversations. We got a terrific panel here that I'll introduce in just a moment. This was originally billed as a conversation on the 2012 campaign, which, as near as I can tell, makes you the last 105 people in America that still wants to talk about the 2012 campaign.
Don't count these 4.
So the good news is, I think we're gonna look forward and spend a lot more time tonight talking about what comes next as a result of last month's election than revisiting them anymore. However, in fairness to our organizers, the original flyer did say we would take a look ahead at 2012 and beyond. So in that spirit, I would like to make a few predictions about the 2012 campaign. I predict that Mitt Romney will be the Republican nominee for president and that he will name Paul Ryan, another not nearly as well-known congressman from Wisconsin, as his running mate. I predict that Clint Eastwood will steal the show at the Republican National Convention by moving an empty chair, that President Barack Obama will fail to appear at the first presidential debate, and 1 week before the presidential election, an unprecedented and devastating hurricane will hit the East Coast of the United States. Thank you very much.
I'm impressed.
Now we are going to move forward, and I do want to take a minute to introduce our panel because I think we really do have a terrific group here tonight, and I think they'll be able to provide us with a tremendous amount of insight and analysis looking forward at what to expect, particularly here in Sacramento and on the state political and governmental landscape in the months ahead. I'm going to start directly to my right is Sherry.
That's weird.
Yeah, how about that? It never fails. Yeah. Sherry Jeffe is a senior fellow at the USC Price School of Public Policy at the University of Southern California and the political analyst for NBC Los Angeles. In the past, she has served as a political analyst for NBC4 in Washington, D.C., for BBC Scotland and BBC Wales. She continues to be an analyst for the Today Show and on BBC Scotland, on BBC Wales, BBC London, BBC World Service Programs, and Al Jazeera English. Please join me in welcoming back to the country.
Hi, guys. Thank you.
Skipping ahead because we start with our USC faculty first. That's the rule. That's the law. I'm going to skip over my friend Evan Halper for just 1 second. And sitting next to Evan is Dr. Raphael Bostic. And Dr. Bostic, for those of you who have not met him, has taken over as the chair of the Judith and John Bedrosian
Center
for Public Policy at the Price School at the University of Southern California. For 3 years, he was the Obama administration's Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. In that position, he advised HUD's Secretary on Policy and Research, promoted informed decisions of HUD policy programs and budget and legislative proposals. Raphael has returned from Washington to help us on campus, and the Bedrosian Center is really one of the shining jewels of our academic and co-curricular activity on campus. Join me in welcoming Dr. Bostic back from his foreign country. I skipped over my friend Evan Halper for just a moment. Evan is the Sacramento Bureau Chief of the Los Angeles Times. He's covered the state capitol since 2002, and he's written about the state's political dysfunction and persistent fiscal crisis through the administrations of 3 governors. He spent last year as a Knight Wallace Fellow at the University of Michigan Law School, where he researched the politics of renewable energy. In addition to his work at the LA Times, he's worked at the Philadelphia Inquirer and Newsweek, one of the most respected journalists in California and the nation. Join me in welcoming Evan Halper. And last but certainly not least, at the far end of this table, is Amy Chance, who's the political editor of the Sacramento Bee. Amy has covered California politics and government for 25 years. She supervises a staff of journalists who cover the state legislature, the gubernatorial administration, ballot measures, and statewide political campaigns. She has reported on most of the state's major political figures since coming to Sacramento, including former governors Pete Wilson, Gray Davis, and Arnold Schwarzenegger, U.S. Senator Feinstein, and current Governor Jerry Brown. She also holds the distinction of being the very first reporter I met when I moved to Sacramento 20-some years ago.
And she stayed.
And she stayed in spite of that, our friend Amy Chance. Amy, thank you so much. But we are going to spend tonight looking forward in the Capitol and on the state's government and political landscape, but without spending too much time revisiting the results of the 2012 campaign, it is instructive to take a look back at least as how that election finally played out, if only to set the landscape for the discussion going forward. So Amy, I'm going to start with you. Since I introduced you last, it's only fair to come to you with the first question. So it's election night in the Sacramento Bee Capitol Bureau, and your political staff, your reporting staff, has prepared for every possible eventuality, covering the results of not only the statewide ballot initiatives, but the legislative campaigns. Describe that night's election coverage, would you?
Sure. First of all, we always go to the main newsroom for election night, so we're not in the Capitol Bureau. We are all clustered around the Chipotle line in the newsrooms. You have to get the whole picture. It's the full Sacramento Bee newsroom. And Dan's right. You know, I have been doing this, I think, more than 25 years now, and I'm very rarely surprised by anything on an election night. Usually over the final weekend, things start to break. You start to see the direction that things are heading. For example, on Prop 30, you know, by the weekend before, I was pretty sure that it would pass. Although the exit polling came out on the day of the election, and the exit polling had it at 8 points up in the first wave. And so I went in and reported to my superiors, and I said, well, it's 8 points up in the exit poll, but it'll be a lot closer than that before the night's over. And of course, I looked today, it was 10 points today, and by the degree to which it went forward. But so I thought I had a good idea. And we had been covering some major storylines during the year, and one of them was the storyline of whether we would get a 2/3 majority for Democrats in the legislature, in the Senate, but never. And that's the part that I just can't. I never prepared. I didn't think anything about the assembly, whatever, and about somewhere between 11 p.m. and midnight on election night, Tori Van Oot, who's our very good blogger and legislative reporter, and USC graduate, I would say that. You sent us someone wonderful. She is sitting at her computer, she's looking at the numbers, and all of a sudden she says, "The assembly!" And we all went, "What?" And of course, at that point, we have no planned story for the Sacramento Bee that's about that very issue. And Tori scrambled. She laid down a story. We got a story. We called Pears, and he said, "Yeah, we're going to win it." And we managed to get a story in the next day's paper. But we only made half the papers with the story. For home delivery. But it's also another rare time in these days when you're actually breaking a story for most of your readers in print. But that was the dynamic, and that, frankly, I think in terms of what we're looking forward, in terms of what comes next, is the most important thing that happened on election night in terms of covering the California legislature and California politics, is the fact that the Democrats are now so solidly in control.
Now, Governor Brown and the Democrats did not win a narrow victory on election night. They won a very large one. Yet the morning after the election, the first thing Jerry Brown said is, this is not a mandate for more taxes. We're going to proceed with caution. And he seems to be working very hard to temper the expectations of his strongest allies. Talk a little bit about how that dynamic is developing and what to watch for going forward.
Yeah, I mean, you also saw a lot of talk from the legislative leaders saying the same thing initially. That lasted probably about a day and a half. The Assembly Speaker had said, no, we're not going to overreach. We got no plans for taxes. We have no plans for anything. A 2/3 majority means nothing. It just means, we have more people who can govern with us, but we're not going to do anything with it. The pro tem tried to hold that line of reasoning, and about halfway into his first press conference, he started to say, I don't want to obsess about not overreaching. He started talking about all the things that we need to start restoring, about ways we can put money back. I think there's going to be a huge amount of tension. You're going to start seeing the kind of relationship that the governor had with Democrats back in the early 80s and late 70s when he was trying to be the moderate, reasonable one, and that was a time when they didn't have a supermajority, but they had more liberal Republicans. They had some liberal Republicans they could work with, and he was. I think he was the last governor to be overridden, and I don't know if that's going to happen again, but we're certainly expecting that he's going to try to hold the line. The legislature, they're not going to do something obvious like, try to pass raise the income tax brackets again, but there's other things they can do. They're subtler things. They might come to pass in the way Obamacare is implemented, for example. There's fees that could be imposed. There's all kinds of regulations that in some cases may involve fees, in other cases may involve Democrats want to do something to business, but they don't want to do it till the last minute in the dead of night, and there's rule waivers they can get by having a 2/3 majority. And so that they can put things into urgency measures and they can happen very quickly. There's also, there's already proposals to tweak Prop 13 on the ballot. I mean, all these things are going to create, a lot of tension between the governor and legislative Democrats, and this talk from the legislative leaders that they're going to work with the governor and they're not going to do anything unexpected with this supermajority. I wouldn't believe any of it.
So Sherry, Evan doesn't believe it. Talk a little bit. I mean, Jerry Brown, over the years, and you're in a position to offer us some guidance on this.
I'm that old.
No, I didn't mean that. Whenever I read the East Coast media on Jerry Brown, I invariably read a story that explains to me that he is a liberal. I can read another one that explains to me that he is a moderate. And what I've devoted a great deal of time over the years trying to explain to media from outside our state is, if anything, he's an iconoclast.
Oh, that's a part of it, yeah, Dan.
So talk a little bit about this governor and this legislature and the sort of flashpoints that Evan's begun to identify.
First, what you need to know is that, and this is Jerry Brown's conceptualization, is he practices the canoe theory of politics. He has said this himself, and all the time I've been watching him, he has done it this way. And that is, you paddle a little to the left, you paddle a little to the right, and that sends you down the middle. He is, above everything, a pragmatist. I mean, this is a guy who opposed Prop 13 of 1978, and when it passed in June of 78, when he would be on the ballot in the general election, announced, I support it, I'm a born-again tax cutter. Now, however, I get the feeling that the guy really does want to accomplish something. I'm one of these wackos who have this pop theory of political philosophy that his whole life has been about dad. Pat Brown, and I am convinced that the reason he ran for the third term was so that he could do the one thing his dad couldn't do, which was run for a third term and win. So Jerry's out to create a legacy in neon. This is, Sherry's wacko.
No, he said it himself. He said it himself. He says he wants
did?
to get shit
See,
done.
I didn't even know that.
Get shit done.
Yeah, he wants to get
He said
something
too many people
done.
he knows are dying now,
And-
and he's getting
and
older.
that
that's what
doesn't-
he wants.
7-second delay on this, just for the.
Yeah, well, beep.
Sorry.
And I think that's what he's about. And I don't think he's going to allow the Democrats to roll over him. But I want to go back just a little bit and warn you. You all are talking about this great 2/3 majority. The Democrats don't have it yet. There's a huge game of musical chairs going on. There are 2 state senators who will be going to Congress. There will be 2 special elections. My state senator, Curran Price, is running for Los Angeles City Council, and I expect he'll at least be in the runoff. He probably will win. There are other, as term limits has given us, there are other members of the legislature, both houses, who will be running for other offices. We don't know how this thing is going to shake out yet. So there isn't a 2/3 majority yet. And I've never known a Democratic Party that has marched in lockstep to anybody. So don't assume that the governor or the legislative leadership is going to be able to push things through even if they wanted to. It's going to play out like this. And I said, just answer me one question, Governor Brown. It's 3 weeks before the election. Why didn't you do this 6 weeks before the election? And he said, Sherry, you know why. You've written about it. It wasn't time. When he puts his mind to something and he thinks it's time, he goes nuts over it. And I think he now believes that this theory can continue on through his tenure, however long it is. It's a very long and convoluted answer, but.
I'm going to come back in a minute and ask you to go even longer and more convoluted.
Oh, that's easy.
And I want to come back to the state dynamic in a minute, because I think Sherry makes an important point, not just about the turnover in the legislature, but the dynamics within the Democratic caucus. And I'd like to ask Evan and Amy about that in a minute. But for just a moment, let's broaden this discussion. Because as I think many of you know who watch politics, not just in California, but across the country, you know that for many, many years, voters, California and America both, were very fond of the idea of divided government. We have 2 parties that keep an eye on each other. And not only are we seeing one-party government here in California, but it's a trend that's really emerging across the nation. Raphael, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit, not just about the state, but from a broader level, about this change in the demeanor of the electorate.
Sure. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be in Sacramento after a long absence. And Dan, thank you and Janet, thank you for having me here. To me, the election was really interesting because, if you want to look at meta messages, one that I think hasn't been talked about enough is that we're seeing the electorate say more and more, someone's got to figure this out, so let's give someone control and let them try to do it. And then if they don't do it, then we'll vote them out. Mm-hmm. And what we've seen in this last election gave 37 states single party control. Mm-hmm. Right, 37. That's 8 years ago it was 20. Right, so we've seen a sea change in how the states are viewing their politics, and how they are looking for solutions and how they think solutions can be delivered. And on one level, you might say that this is a function of the hyper-partisanship of how everything happens, and hoping that moderates will figure out how to carve out a middle that can be sustained over time is something that we don't really believe can happen anymore. So let's try some things and hope that the rules are such and the coalitions that get built are built such that you don't wind up with super extreme outcomes. I think that remains to be seen, actually, how this plays out. I think what Evan was talking about in the dynamic here in Sacramento and what the Democrats are going to face is how far to the left they go, how many gimmicks they try, how much does it actually cost them. I don't know. but we're about to find out. This is, on some level, this is a grand experiment that we're doing along with, the 36 other states that have ceded power completely to one side, and that'll be interesting. I think just the one thing I would overlay on everything that's been said, about Governor Brown's legacy and the like. Prop 30 notwithstanding, California still has some significant policy challenges in terms of its budget. Right, so we're not going to be able to, it's not party time. Let's all just go out and start passing things, because they do have implications. And I was at a lunch panel earlier today where the speaker was noting that all the little things that you could squeeze out of the budget are squeezed. Right, we're in meat and potatoes territory. Right, so any little tweaks here, they have meat and potatoes implications. And when you're in that space, there's only so much shenanigans you can do. There are only so many gimmicks you can run, because someone is going to feel the pinch, and that pinch is going to be significant. And how that interacts with this supermajority and with the ability of the Republicans to say it's their fault if it doesn't work, that's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out.
I want to come to the Republicans a little bit later and discuss whether it's their fault is a message on which a party rebuilds itself in California.
No.
Let's put
I
that
think-
aside.
I
for a
think
second.
yes.
Point.
Sherry, you wanted to make a
Yeah,
point.
I mean, Raphael is exactly right. I was talking to someone from the administration today, and he said his biggest worry was that he has the feeling that the state now feels Prop 30 passed, we're out of the woods, which is not the case.
That's right.
As Raphael said, what Prop 30 did basically was plug a little hole, and we start the cycle all over again. And I think that's going to be very risky if the legislature agrees with that point, that, let's just spend because we're done. We've got a little bitty $1 billion deficit now. Things are cool. They could really, really make it difficult.
And Evan, let's go back and talk about that flashpoint a little bit. You spoke to it a little bit earlier. But if you look back to the Prop 30 campaign, Governor Brown at the outset recognized he had two communications and political challenges. The first was to convince voters that our public schools needed more money. And at least according to our USC Dorrance LA Times poll and the other public polling done around the state, he succeeded on that one pretty quickly. The overwhelming majority of Californians believed that our K-12 public education system was not funded adequately. The other challenge was to convince those voters that state government could be trusted to spend that money effectively. And I watched him on TV the week before the election, probably when he was at KNBC with Sherry, and he said, I've done pension reform, we've done a budget with welfare reform, I'm fiscally responsible, I fly Southwest Airlines, I even take the damn middle seat. And one of the hurt to tell him that on Southwest Airlines, Governor, the middle seat isn't any less expensive. But it seems to me, listening to what he has said since the election, that he recognizes that voters are not yet convinced. They basically suspended disbelief to grant state government the money, and he still feels like he has to convince them that they can be fiscally responsible. Talk a little bit about where that runs into some of the legislature's ambitions, particularly, and to be fair to them, given the fact that some of their strongest supporters have had their budgets cut pretty severely in recent years.
Yeah, they don't see the $2 billion budget deficit there. They see everything's been cut. We've been cut so much. We've been dealing with, double-digit billion-dollar deficits for, as far as they can remember. And now, as far as they're concerned, there's almost no deficit, and it's time to start restoring, even though there still is a deficit. So you run that into a legislature where you have legislative leaders who have their own interest in building legacies, just like the governor does, and their what they want to build legacies on are different than what he's looking at. And you also have a legislature that has been on its best behavior in the last year. I mean, we haven't seen this kind of friction because there's been, they've all been in the same path. They've been purposely not giving the governor job killer bills, as the Chamber of Commerce calls them, purposely not passing things that would put him in a tough spot. They needed to pass this. They needed to patch this hole with this Prop 30. Now that's done, and they're not all working at common purposes anymore. And this group of people, in the legislature individually, I talk to my colleague George Skelton about this all the time. Individually, they're all like smart, interesting, intelligent, independent people. Somehow, as a body, they never seem to be able to make the right decision. It's, they're completely out of touch. And as much as they're talking about how hard they're trying, and I do agree that it's with the supermajority not yet secure and with the possibility of losing at any time and some of these seats really wobbling. I mean, some of these Democrats are, they would have been conservative Republicans 30 years ago. They're not all going to be in lockstep, but there's definitely a lot of room for mischief, and that's what I'm expecting looking forward.
When you start talking about, do low-income people need dental care, you get down to that level of discussion. We've talked to advocates. We have a story running tomorrow, in fact, about this very issue, about the fact that there are advocates who are looking at least to restore some of the child care for low-income families. Very specific programs that, as you say, a little bit at a time, you start to think, well, that makes sense. Well, why couldn't we do that? And that they're going to be getting that pressure. Then on the other hand, you're going to have bigger interests. I mean, labor, there are rumblings already that they'd like to see the minimum wage raised. Interested in bringing back rolling back some of the tax cuts, not loopholes for specific groups, rather than raising taxes as a whole. So they are all of these new people, and this is the most new members we've had here in a generation coming to the Capitol, are going to be hearing from advocates who have good, reasonable cases to make about what's happening.
I told one of your reporters for a story a week or two ago that every freshman legislator comes to the Capitol with grand ambitions, and it's the governor's job to get them to calm down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I guess the follow-up real quick to you, Amy, is all of you have lined up the broader parameters of where this debate starts to get tense. And I guess I'd ask you a little bit more specifically. As Evan mentioned earlier, it looks like the legislature probably does not move to raise tax rates. On the other extreme, it seems unlikely that they are going to follow Governor Brown for any additional pension reform. That said, there's a lot of discussion about lowering the threshold for passage of local taxes. Mm-hmm. There's some talk in a slightly lower voices about a split roll on Prop 13. Where do you think where and when does push come to shove?
Well, I would say just the day after the election, the Assembly Speaker was talking about the idea of reviving his middle-class scholarship, which sort of maybe goes to Evan's point about leaders wanting legacy. That's a several $100 million item right there. How does he pay for that? There's going to be a big dance around a lot of it, and each group will want to, bring things forward. And honestly, I do think it's going to be Jerry Brown with his finger in the dike for a lot of times. He wants to convince people, and he did it, I would say, not just for the Prop 30 campaign. I think he really came in knowing he wanted to raise taxes, and he very consciously worked to show people that he was going to pay attention to the small symbols of economy, as he did with the car in his first administration. The idea that he was going to take away cell phones from state workers was a huge story statewide. That was something that resonated with people. So he's very good, and he worked very carefully at all those small symbols. And he's going to be very reluctant to give away any of that mileage that he got, during that period of time.
Sherry, I find it fascinating that the state of California can cut $1.2 billion out of Medi-Cal, and it receives a relatively small amount of attention from the public and the media. Mm-hmm. You take cellular phones away from public employees, and that leaves the news on every television.
Dan, it's good television. I mean, eyes glaze over when you talk about $1.2 million from the budget. But, the average Californian, at least the average Angelino, theoretically goes nuts. It's a symbol. As Amy said.
My question is, does that type of symbolism, at which Jerry Brown is extraordinarily talented?
Yes, he is.
Does that provide him the leeway to move toward the legislature on policy, or is that not the way he sees things?
Well, what do you mean leeway to move toward the legislature on policy?
Does it give him cover?
Yes.
Yes, it gives him cover. Thank you. Amy, it does give him cover. How much, though, I don't know. But it's clear to me that he's building from the little symbols to allow him later on to say, as Amy said, look, I've done this, trust me, we need X, Y, and Z. And I agree with Amy. I'm hearing that one of the first programs that they're going to be looking at is the dental care under Medicaid. It's something like, what, $100 million. Pretty soon it's going to be real money. But I don't know how can Jerry Brown say no to dental care for poor kids?
Raphael, I had a question for you, but it sounds like you wanted to weigh in on a point that Jerry was making.
Yeah, so I think the politics could be even more complicated. I mean, Jerry Brown could view the Prop 30 campaign as his ability to do things that no one else in the state can do.
I
Right,
think he
so-
does. I
so-
think you're absolutely right about that,
So
Raphael.
he has a power base.
Wrong.
Well, no, but-
Not you, him.
I had to make sure on that. You never know. You never know. She jumps in. So
We do this all the time.
So the question is, what mandate does he take from this, and how much does he view himself as being able to stand apart and say, I know what the right answer is. I don't care what these stupid people in the assembly are saying. I don't care what the people. I know the answer, and when they come up with things that don't make sense, I'm just not going to do it.
Well, if he's-
And the other thing that I wanted to say, just from his symbolism and from all the campaigns that we saw through this season, is that this election was a tremendously powerful statement about how a good campaign makes a big difference. Right? So Jerry Brown ran a really good campaign. He started this campaign 2.5, 3 years ago to get to this point. If you look at the national level, the Obama campaign apparatus would just outclass the Romney folks, so that a person who had no business winning a re-election, given where the economy was, basically had an early night, right? That
Yeah,
was.
but don't underestimate the impact of a lousy opponent.
Hey, Raphael, let me ask you a question since you brought up the national landscape. Again, I am paraphrasing here, that he suggested that the passage of Prop 30 would not necessarily lead to a frenzy of tax increases, but as he put it, would lead to an era and a national movement of voters becoming more and more increasingly willing to fund what they consider to be necessary services. Do you see national ramifications in the passage of 30 in that regard?
I think there are many legislators, many politicians who viewed the concept of talking about raising taxes as immediate death. Right? So we weren't getting the full range of policy options that you might want to consider and how you would solve these problems and fill these holes. And what Prop 30 does is it says, look, California was the Prop 13 place. It was the place that you didn't go to the electorate with these sorts of requests because there's no hope of doing it. At least that's a symbol. And he's like, there is hope. So don't be afraid. Try some things. Think about what the right answer is, and then run, a tremendous campaign to get there, because it's not easy, but it's doable.
If I might add, the other thing that I'm going to continually remind myself and my reporters as we look back on this election is the move that Brown made to move Proposition 32 to the November ballot. He changed the landscape on which he was fighting.
Yep.
He completely changed the structure and said, oh, we're going to do these initiatives all in November. And so then you suddenly had him on the same ballot with a measure that labor was going to go all out to defeat.
Just a quick follow-up on that, Amy, if I can. The presumption at the time when the governor moved the initiatives to the fall ballot is that he simply would have preferred to see a vote on Prop 32 on a ballot with a presidential election, general election campaign, and therefore decrease its chances of passage. What I hear you saying, and I want to make sure I understand you right, is that may have been a motivation, but the other motivation is that the campaign that was run against Prop 32 picked up Prop 30 and dragged it along as well.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think we would have seen 10 points. I mean, I can't predict, how much it might have won by or not, that kind of thing, but it certainly wouldn't have been 10 points, and we wouldn't have had the whole dynamic of the Democratic landslide.
Tony Quinn, who's in the audience right there, made a very important point. It even goes beyond that. It was the Republicans who were basically blocking putting something like Prop 30 on a special election ballot in 2011. And in California, a special election tends to favor the Republicans because they're higher propensity voters. And that's another reason why it went on to the 2012. It could have been on the 2012 primary ballot, but the Democrats, quite rightly from their perspective, realized that, again, there wasn't going to be a presidential primary on the Democratic side. The Republicans, they thought, would have a feisty primary, and the general electorate always looks a little bit more Democratic than the primary electorate. And so, in general, they moved all initiatives, but the Democrats basically owe a lot of thanks to the Republicans for not going along with a special election on the issue.
For those of you who didn't see it, Tony Quinn wrote a terrific piece on the Fox and Hounds website this morning.
He'll autograph it.
He already has. About the changing demographics of California. I want to talk demographics in just a minute or two, but before we move on, to stay on public policy, I'm going to come back to you, Evan, and keep prodding you guys. We talked about Prop 13 a minute ago, and whether or not this is a bookend or not. But, as you mentioned earlier, there are various aspects of Prop 13 that are now under some pretty significant scrutiny from the Democratic majorities. Like I said earlier, there's talk about lowering the threshold for taxes at the local level, and there's even some talk about a split roll. Where do you think this conversation goes? What's the future of Prop 13 in the months in the cycle ahead?
Well, I think when it's explained to the public, there's support for split roll, there's support for lowering the threshold on local property taxes, but there was or local sales taxes, but there was also a as you've mentioned many times, Dan, a wide support among the public for something like Prop 30. And you could see as soon as you start going near those third rails, you can get derailed very quickly. And I agree with everything everyone's saying here that he did win this campaign. He showed that he's a political mastermind. The problem is that he never doubted that for a second. And that when we saw this campaign winning by how many points it was winning by, we realized in the newsroom this guy's going to be insufferable going forward. And this is what happened with him. When he was governor the first time, he had his 70% approval rating. He didn't need anyone. He didn't need if you're a media person, you didn't need a press secretary. You didn't need this. You didn't need that. And he overplayed his hand, and by the time he left, the legislature was completely annoyed with him. His approval rating had dropped. Prop 13 had passed, and so it just seems like I'm talking about this friction that I expect to happen between him and the legislature, because I do think that he is at a place where he probably will be insufferable going forward, and he's not about to listen to anyone in the legislature, and he's got it all figured out, and he knows what he wants to do, and I think that's going to be a challenge. So, and whether they do anything with split roll or property or local tax threshold, I think a lot of it will depend on whether he's interested.
Hey, Raphael, I want to come to you in just a second, but Amy, I want to follow up with you on a point that Evan made. First of all, do you find the governor of California to be insufferable? No, the question.
Remember, this is being
Don't
videotaped.
answer that. Don't answer that.
The question.
No, but we have had our arguments over the years. Yeah.
Which governor is that? Okay. Amy, the question I was going to ask is, do you or your reporters have any sense of where the governor himself comes down on this conversation about Prop 13, either the local tax threshold or the split roll?
I do not, and I would defer to Sherry on that. Jerry Brown's had one go round with Proposition 13, so just on the natural, there are a lot of other things he'd probably like to get done. He's got water on his agenda for this time. I can't imagine that he's going to get bogged down in a proposition.
He may not get bogged down, but he may be forced to consider it. Because I do think that if anything happens with Prop 13, it will be the split roll. It makes sense for the Democrats to try to do it. And I also think that...
Well, and at this point, they can put it on the ballot without him, right?
Exactly.
They don't need him.
And they've got enough wiggle room in that not-so-super majority that they can do it.
Unsolicited opinion from the moderator. I think the smarter political tack is probably to start with the threshold on local taxes, but that's a conversation.
Oh, no, that was what my next point was, that I think there will be bipartisan support for allowing the local communities to decide, because A, it takes a hot potato out of the lap of the legislature. I mean, it's a perfect public policy issue for this legislature.
Raphael, you were going to make a point?
So I don't live in Sacramento, and I don't see the governor close up. I did see the governor when he was mayor. And one thing that was interesting to me was that he complained about all the things he did when he was governor, when he was the mayor.
He did.
And so the question, maybe this is a naive hope that I had on my part, was that he had actually learned something from all those experiences and would be less likely to repeat the excesses of the past. I mean, to hear you, it just sounds like deja vu all over again. And I'm trying to be more optimistic than that. I mean, you're not feeling it.
Evan
Halper is a tough place to stay optimistic.
I'm also, and I should say, in my office, I sit next to George Skilton. And so he's very cynical, and he has, some thoughts on sort of the governor and his ego that, may have infected my thinking.
Let's do this. I've monopolized the questions long enough. Let's open this up to questions from all of you.
I'd like to hear from some of you about what your sense is as to the role that moderate Democrats will play in the process, and will they be a brake on some issues, or given the fact that Proposition 25 lets trailer bills be passed with a majority vote, simple majority vote, do they just not matter? And in that case, is Brown the only brake?
Great question. For those of you who didn't hear it, Tim asked a question about the more moderate Democrats in the two legislative caucuses and the role they'll play going forward. Sherry talked a little bit earlier about the turnover of members leaving for new offices. But as you also pointed out, Sherry, not every Democrat is a reliable vote on every one of these issues. Maybe we can offer some thoughts on the inherent tensions there.
Don't forget that there are, as a result of the new redistricting, there are competitive districts and there are Democrats who now represent districts that are either just slightly Democratic or slightly Republican, and they've got to be very careful about what they do. What role will the moderates play? Well, I think they're a part of the reality that there really isn't a super majority. And I think they'll probably get along better with the governor than the liberals will in the Democratic caucuses. I think they're more on the same track than the liberals will. And I think both Speaker Perez and President Pro Tem Steinberg are smart enough to know that they ought not to get so far away from the governor that it begins to hurt their future career path. I mean, the latest buzz I'm hearing is they're going to be up against one another in 2018 in the it's no longer in the top two primary for lieutenant governor. And this state isn't ready to go so far to the left that the moderate Democrats are frozen out.
Amy, just to follow up on this, for years and years, at least since I've been in California, and I assume for quite a while before that, the business community tended to line up, not in lockstep, but fairly strongly with the Republican legislative caucuses. And it appears, because of the 2/3 that the Democrats have achieved, that they're turning their focus to that group of moderate Democrats that
right, and they worked in some of those elections too. So that is happening and will be a part of it. I think it just depends on the issues. I mean, I think you're right. If it's a trailer bill and it doesn't need a lot of votes and they maybe can work things in, they will use that method. And if it's something that's a bigger public policy issue, I mean, there are all kinds of issues about driver's licenses for illegal immigrants, lots of social policy issues that could be coming forward now that we're going to have to take it on a case-by-case basis and see where people's hearts are. And it could very well be that we get lots of split votes, that it's just a more nuanced Democratic Party, and we're going to have to get a lot better at not just counting Democrats and Republicans and actually look at each individual legislator and who they are and what they believe and what motivates them.
So I actually think that's a really good question and almost impossible to answer, right? Because you have to remember, we've now elected all these people under a different set of rules, and this is the first time they're actually having to live as an elected official under this new set of rules. So we're going to learn what they have learned from having to run in these new type of campaigns, and what they are drawing as the implication of how they need to vote and behave in the legislative body. My guess is that you're going to, two things. First, supermajority is a broad coalition, right? It takes a wide policy range of perspectives, and we're going to see how good a speaker Speaker Perez is, right? So part of this is how effectively can the speaker keep his coalition together?
Don't we?
And then the second is we're about to learn sort of what all these moderates in these swing uncertain districts view about their districts. And my guess, we're going to see two strategies. One, I'm going to hew to my district. One, I'm going to hew to my party. And then 2 years from now, we'll see if the ones that hew, who's reelected. And that'll tell us sort of how this new body is going to play out.
Before we go to the next question.
You're so optimistic.
Well, I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and just follow up on a point that Raphael made all too briefly, because I think it's a tremendously important one. Just as last month's elections were the first to take place under the new redistricting rules and the new top two primary rules, this will be the first legislative session in which the members realize that they will be facing those rules in 2 years or 4 years. And if you think about it, since time immemorial, in the California legislature, or for that matter in Congress, an elected member of either party knew for all practical purposes that they would never, ever, ever lose a general election campaign. So you know that you can lie, you can cheat, you can steal, you can commit fraud, you can commit felonies, you can hide cash money in the freezer compartment of your refrigerator, and you're going to win re-election. The only thing that would ever possibly cost you re-election, not in a general election campaign, but in a primary. So you can lie, cheat, or steal. The one thing you can't do is reach out across party lines to try to work with someone on the other side to get something done. And the R&D designations notwithstanding, and I think Amy made the right point about that, you do. And Raphael may or may not be optimistic about the outcome, but he makes the exact right point. This is the first generation of legislators in the history of California that understand that the sure ticket to re-election is not just automatically adhering to the wishes of their party's most vocal, most liberal Democrats or most conservative Republicans. I think it's a terrific point. You can talk again on the next question.
Chris Ware, Price School. One of the details that's really haunted the California budget over the last decade is just the volatility of our tax revenues. They boom during good times and they crater during bad times. And Prop 30 just made that fact much worse. So is there any hope, or are we just about to get start a new boom cycle where we spend all that money and we're going to have a huge deficit again in 3 years? Or is there any hope of fixing this volatility problem? Or does anyone even recognize this problem?
So the question was about the California legislature's historic propensity toward boom and bust budgeting. Chris, I will tell you, I think you're giving the legislature more credit than they deserve using that term, because boom and bust budgeting means that they stop spending money during
Bust.
I would suggest that you refer to this as the Wile E. Coyote school of budgeting. You run off the cliff and you realize there's nothing beneath you and you finally fall.
On Prop 30, the liberal wing of the Democratic Party pushed the governor to the left on that issue. He had to compromise and, as you know, get a measure that had some more
And
volatility.
just by virtue of refresher, because I know everybody read the coverage at the time, but remind everybody about what the governor's initiative originally was, and then why it became what it became.
I'm not going to be able to do all the details, but very specifically, you could tell that it was crafted in such a way that he understood that just tax the rich and tax the rich was not where he wanted to go, because he had the sales tax increase as part of the measure, and he wanted more balance in that regard. And then, you know, there was a competing measure that was being circulated, and there was the feeling that perhaps that one might prevail and have more appeal to voters, and so he compromised to get it off the ballot, and that's why that happened. But the other thing that I thought was intriguing that Steinberg talked about after the election was the idea that he would be interested in exploring a change with the sales tax, where you might lower the sales tax but extend it to services. And so with the Senate President Pro Tem talking about it, I would be very interested to see if that's a way that they might start to try to get at the volatility question.
Evan, on that very last point, Governor Schwarzenegger appointed a commission that recommended just that, expanding the sales tax to services. And as near as I can tell, it went on a top shelf in the governor's office and has not yet moved.
Well, it was worse than that. The panel, which was supposed to be
You're talking about a USC college, so be careful.
the panel, which was supposed to be a bipartisan sort of, let's overhaul the tax code and fix this, and I guess it was Jerry Parsky was the chair of the panel. They came up with this plan, and then the panel like split, and there was a minority report where the Democrats on the panel said this is outrageous, this is this is big business, is just steamrolling this whole thing. And it's just a reminder that anytime you try to tinker with the tax code here, I mean, you're exactly right on what this does. Yeah, we fill a hole by exacerbating the structural problem we have in the deficit, and there's a lot of talk out there that we want to fix this, we want to have tax reform, we want to have 2-year budgeting, we want to have performance-based budgeting. A lot of this was on the ballot, Prop 31, and that thing, I think it didn't do as bad as Molly Munger's initiative, but I think it was the second most poorly performing measure. And it's hard to imagine, even with this talk of, you have this group of billionaires and elder statesmen called Think Long Committee. Their big proposal is to expand the sales tax of services, but expanding the sales tax of services usually needs to come with some other. Tax reform is supposed to be revenue neutral, right? So if you expand the sales tax of services, so you're taking more taxes there, you're supposed to get less taxes somewhere else. And what always winds up happening with these things is there's winners and losers anytime you tinker with the tax code. And, the winners and losers are very big and very influential, and the losers always manage to torpedo the thing. And so, I'm not particularly hopeful that, not to be the panel pessimist here, but I mean, that there's going to be the kind of tax reform that needs to happen here, unless it happens from some. I don't see the legislature doing it because of the loser question, but I do think it's possible some outside group manages to get its act together in a way that Think Long and California Forward weren't in the last election, and come up with an expansion to services that voters support. But I would expect to see it not out of the legislature, but out of some outside independent.
Other questions?
Can I ask one?
Of course.
Oh, it occurred to me as we were discussing all of this, the one thing that we didn't address that really is interesting me now, and basically I'm going to throw a stink bomb into the middle of the room. We haven't talked about the relationship between the fiscal cliff, and this goes back to your Wile E. Coyote and your question. We haven't really talked about what the fiscal cliff might mean. How would the fiscal cliff impact California? And we're talking about budget, and we're talking about revenues, and we have been ignoring an incredibly large factor out of the control of the state and the state legislature that could very, very severely impact the future of California. I don't know. I mean, people I've been talking to indicate that if we do go off the fiscal cliff and we lose federal funding, that ultimately the projection could well be a recession in the first 2 quarters of the following year. But I don't see how we can talk about the future of California without talking about what's going on in Washington and the fiscal cliff. So that's my question.
Raphael, you just returned from 3 years in Washington, and by your own admission, you are an optimist, so I assume you believe the President and the Speaker will come to an agreement before December 31st and make Sherry's question irrelevant.
No. So, I mean, the difficulty with all these things, I think, Evan, you were talking about, the moving parts all touch each other. And so it's very difficult to know what, if we went over the cliff, that would mean, because the world is very complicated. I do think they're going to figure out a deal. Whether it will be the details ironed out, everyone's voted and all that stuff by December 31st, I doubt it. And it's only because, we've heard a lot about framework, right? We want a little increase in the top rates for income tax. We need some sort of entitlement reform, but the details around all of those matter a lot. And, one thing that I saw, well, everyone should have seen it. When they almost shut down the government, I think a year and a half ago, it was a broad framework for spending, but the details weren't ironed out for weeks and weeks afterwards. So in our agency, we didn't actually know what our budget was. We knew we could still have people come to work on Monday, which we weren't sure we were going to be able to do. But beyond that, how much we could support a particular program, was there going to be resources for travel and just the basics of functioning? We didn't really know. So I actually think the biggest, their eyes in Washington, if I had to put myself in their position, is we do not want any impacts on our credit ratings. We don't want any impacts in the stock market and in the business flow of capital, flow of business capital. And we don't have to iron out, I think they're saying to themselves, we don't have to iron out all those details to prevent that from happening. But at some point, we are going to have to get to those details. That won't be done by December 31st, is what I would guess.
So, what we can do, and I'll suggest this humbly to the people who run the Sacramento Center here, that perhaps it would be a good idea to gather in January and talk about either how the fiscal
Yeah.
is solved so we can laud Raphael, or how it wasn't solved so we can ridicule him.
And I won't be here in the latter case, right?
And you know what, the one thing that worries me is that when they have to answer that question, where's the money gonna come from? It's gonna come from money that goes to the states. And it's been, I guess, the figure is anywhere from, California will lose anywhere from $6 billion to $11 billion.
Well, it's a not necessarily overly optimistic, but plausible analysis of the situation to suppose that as close as President Obama and Speaker Boehner got in August of 2011, when both were at the absolute low point of their relative political authority with their two parties, their chances are significantly better on the heels of this last election. That said, looks for either Amy or Evan, both of your newspapers have done extensive coverage on Sherry's question. If this isn't solved, what it might mean to California.
Well, I'll just share my daily life, which is that before the election, when I do the conference call with the Washington Bureau, I was saying, I need a fiscal cliff chart. I need to know what happens in California if we hit the fiscal cliff. I need to understand what the fiscal cliff is. I need my readers to know another word for it besides sequestration and to, and to get that. And almost to a person, there has been a reluctance on the part of some of those editors to really do the scare stories, like Sherry is talking about. They've said, let's give it a little more time. Let's see how the negotiations are going. They have not rushed to say we're going to do a giant headline in the Sacramento Bee that says California's budget could get slashed by $11 billion. There has been a caution and an expectation that there would be some kind of a deal.
I have a really off-the-wall question here, but I'm interested in this particular topic.
Watch this.
We know what the Supreme Court did last Friday. We also know what the election was like in 2012. Did the opponents of Proposition 8 really make a mistake going to the courts rather than going back to the people on this ballot in 2012? And thus would the gay marriage issue have been solved almost certainly by gay marriage being approved, rather than what we face now, which is all the uncertainty about the courts.
Great question about Proposition 8 and whether the opponents of Prop 8 should be encouraged or discouraged that the court has agreed to take up.
Well, not that. Did
No.
they miss their opportunity?
Did they make the
not
wrong
going
decision?
in this election, given what happened in Washington and all these other states, did they miss their opportunity here? Given the way that this election went.
Well, wouldn't that measure just end up in court too?
Why? If they had just
It's a good question. Yes, it would have.
repealed Proposition 8, it would be gone. And
No, but then,
probably the old-
wouldn't the other side challenge that?
No,
But
I mean, they
there'd
could
be
have put
nothing
on
to
a
challenge.
repealer, and you go back to the old Supreme Court rulings, right?
I would suggest this, that according to public opinion polling, ours and others, that even since the passage of Proposition 8, public opinion on this issue has continued to trend at such an accelerated rate
Right.
that it's difficult to imagine an initiative to repeal Prop 8 would not have passed.
Yeah.
If there's someone on the panel who has the legal expertise to talk about whether that would be grist for a further.
I
Supreme Court
know,
challenge
but
or further
I'll
than-
talk about it. Nothing stopped me before, why should it stop me now? No.
Brody psychoanalyzed the governor for us, we'll ask for her legal.
I will now sound Ted Olson and Boyce. No, apparently, the answer to your question might be, and I say might be, that if all the opponents wanted, well, let me put it this way, if the court rules narrowly that it applies only to California, perhaps you're right. I think that Boyce and Olson wanted to fight this on the issue of equal rights, which is a national constitutional issue. If they went on the ballot and they got gay marriage approved, same-sex marriage approved in California, it would not have addressed the broader constitutional issue. So quite frankly, what you've got is people within the state who care about the state and people who are using the issue in this state to try to put into law a broader concept. So there's no easy answer to your question.
Since we all, just real quick, since we all lack the legal expertise to definitively answer your question, I'll offer you a quick political thought on this. Chad Griffin, the head of the Human Rights Campaign, who ran the initiative against Proposition 8 when it was on the ballot, was asked whether he thought the court's decision to accept this was a good or a bad thing politically. And he said, I think very, very diplomatically, I will allow my instincts to be overruled by my respect for Ted Olson
Right,
and David
there you
Boyce,
go.
which strikes me as a very, very polite way of saying, I don't like this at all, but I'm too nice a person to say it.
They had a different agenda than the in-state people.
AG?
We've been talking a lot about a Democratic supermajority, and I wonder if any of the members of the panel, by the way, A.G. Block from Brand X University.
Mr. Block, did you bring along your new logo?
They have.
That was just
Really?
I wonder if any of the panel
Stick one more.
could address how the Republican Party in California rebuilds itself and gets back to a place of relevancy.
Read Tony's piece.
I haven't yet, so I was.
Actually, I'll tell you what, Tony, would you mind taking a minute or so and summarizing the piece here?
Number one, the xenophobia on
It's got
race.
to stop.
That's really hard because the Republican electorate is old and white, and they resent the cultural changes that Latinos and Asians and street signs and Chinese and everything else bring around. But what they have now, they figured it out, because you can look at any of the numbers. Latinos fear them, and even if you try to be nice, given that R after your name, they're going to come out and vote against you. And there's no longer this idea that the Latinos are going to stay home. Finally, they've seen enough numbers, so that's one. Secondly, is what I said was the Little Grover Norquist types led them down the road to defeat. Because as Sherry said, they should have gone on the 2011 ballot. They've got to just stop paying attention to them. And the third thing is they have to take a libertarian view on all of these social issues. Abortion and gay rights, it just doesn't do them any good. If they can do some of that, maybe they can begin to reverse the trends.
But Tony, don't
I
give
think
up the mic because.
just real quick if I can, AG.
Yeah.
I think along with Tony's strategic advice for the party, I think is an extraordinarily important fact. And this is, to me, was the most important part of the story. And I say that not to denigrate your strategic advice, but what he wrote, and I would encourage you to read the piece, is that for the
In
first
Fox and
time-
Hounds.
For the first time, I said that. For the first time, California's electorate caught up with its population.
Yeah.
And for years and years and years, the electorate had been much whiter and much older than the overall population. I mean, that is no longer the case. I think a profound piece of analysis there. Just to add quickly, I think to Tony's second point, I'd simply observe that we live in a state in which the largest cities are known as Los Angeles, San Diego, San Jose, Sacramento, San Francisco, Santa Barbara, Fresno, Chico, and San Luis Obispo,
And I don't know that a political party on either the left or the right can necessarily rebuild itself with a base that consists solely of Bakersfield and Long Beach.
Dan Walters had a column about it this week, and I thought what he said was important for me to understand, which is that basically Dan Walters is not thinking, oh, we're going to, the Republican Party is not going to go out and make more Republicans. The key will be, and was even the truth when Brulte was doing well in the legislature, will be to create a party that appeals to the independents.
Yeah, we were talking before about the moderate Democrats and where they're going to go. If things do start to fracture in the Democratic Party in the legislature, I think there's an opportunity for the Republicans there to, the Chamber of Commerce is going to have an agenda. They're going to want to pass certain what they'll call reforms through, and if they see an opportunity to work with those moderate Democrats, the governor, and there's an opening for Republicans to assert themselves and build, a bare majority to pass some legislation. But, that's really tricky because that group of Democrats has to be willing to defy the speaker and the pro tem. But, give it a year, and I think that'll start to happen. And that's one place for Republicans to start to rebuild.
And Jim Brulte understands that. John Burton, and the governor, whoever it was, really ran the Capitol for a long time. And what Evan made a very important point. The Chamber of Commerce is going to deal with the Democrats. They're very uncomfortable with the ideological bent of the Republican Party, and they understand that the Democrats are in power. They control the agenda. The Republican Party, per se, has got to get away from the far right and move into coalition with those moderate Democrats and bring back the Chamber of Commerce and the business types who are so very nervous, if not totally apprehensive, about the path that the Republican Party in this state has taken.
And I'll forget one other thought on this, and I think it's worth looking back. My first campaign out of college was George Bush Sr., or as we now call him, George Bush Classic, in 1988 against Michael Dukakis. It's worth noting that had this panel taken place right after that, in December, right after that campaign, we would have been talking about a Democratic Party that had lost the popular vote in 5 of the 6 previous presidential elections, just as Republicans have here. And I think it is worth noting, the AG asked exactly the right question, that it's not as if a group of Democratic activists and legislators and fundraisers got together and said, holy smokes, we have to become a more moderate party. What happened instead is a very, very effective leader wrenched the Democratic Party off of its moorings and forced it to become a party that was in favor of free trade, in favor of welfare reform, and other more centrist issues. The question, which I don't think anyone on this panel is capable of answering, is whether that Republican version of Bill Clinton is 4, 8, 12, or 16 years away. But when you talk about parties remaking themselves, my only observation is that parties don't remake themselves. Leaders drag them, and the Clintons and the Reagans tend to drag parties along with them rather than waiting for those parties to decide that they need to do something different.
Well, where is Jim Brulte then that Republican Bill Clinton?
No.
No. The Republican Bill Clinton? I mean,
No.
there is no leadership in that party.
No, but I do think that Dan is right. I mean, so Tony's point about Latinos fearing Republicans, it's a deep statement, right? And fear leads to behavior that persists long after the fear should be gone.
Yep.
Right, and so you need to be able to project someone who does not engender that kind of fear. There are Republicans who do that in their local states. They have not been willing to stand up to the Republican establishment in national campaigns. So George W. Bush, he started there. He tried to move some stuff there and got nowhere, right? And in this last Republican primary, nobody really even tried. I mean, Rick Perry, I think he said at one point, we should at least be nice to the children, and he got yelled down by the crowd, right? And so until we find a Republican candidate who is going to stand up, be strong, and not be punished like severely, it's hard to see where that comes from. But it's going to happen. I mean, at some point, if you're going to be, I mean, I think the National Republicans have realized the numbers are not working in their favor in terms of trends. They're going to have to find an answer to this, and it's going to have to happen sooner rather than later.
Okay, last question for the panel, and it's a fast one. Actually, I'll ask you this. Who will be the general election opponent against Jerry Brown in 2014? A Republican or another Democrat? You don't need a name, just a party.
Or a non-party
Is
preference.
that your prediction?
It's a possibility. I don't know. If it would have to be a very rich, very well-known no-party preference candidate, but we can't rule anything out anymore.
Okay, Sherry says Nicholas Bergruen. What do you think?
I think Dan's gonna be the Republican or
I think
the
there'll be a
non-party
Democrat,
preference.
these people can't wait, 6 years.
Democrat.
Well, I started by telling you that I didn't know on election night that the Democrats were going to take two-thirds control over the state legislature. But at the moment, barring a wealthy candidate from the Republican Party that we're not aware of that comes onto the scene, I would say a Democrat.
Will Gavin Newsom have the nerve to do it?
Why not?
What?
Why not?
Why not?
Well, he'd have to give up being lieutenant governor and take that risk.
Well, just like we promised not to have a conversation about the 2012 elections, it probably doesn't make a lot of sense tonight to have an extensive conversation about the 2014 elections. So let's instead let's thank our panel, Sherry Bebitch Jeffe, Evan Halper, Raphael Bostic, and Amy Chance, for a terrific conversation on the
Let's thank our moderator, our terrific moderator, Dan Shore.